Good day, everybody. Walaikum salam and greetings from an early morning in Dhaka, Bangladesh. A warm welcome to this COP26 side event on the role that infrastructure plays in our resilient future. We'll be focusing on the topic of catalyzing resilience in infrastructure today. With the UN mandate for infrastructure development, UNOPS is grateful to be involved in co-convening this event along with UREP, UNEP, and the ADB. My name is Sharon Lewis, and I'm an infrastructure and partnership specialist with the UNOPS Bangladesh multi-country office, and it is my pleasure to be the facilitator for this event. There's a team of people who've worked to pull this discussion together, and I'd like to acknowledge them before we start. First of all, on the front end, we are getting technology support from Sugar Gonzalez and a technical team based with the ADB. And on the back end, we have a rapporteur, Shalet Untalan from UREP, who will be pulling together a record of our discussions today. Then the key organizers for this event, Belinda Hewitt from ADB, Joseph Stables, Eamon Cow, and Simonetta Siligato from UNOPS, and Tony Chan from UREP. My thanks to all of them for the work they did. Please, can you go to the second slide, Sugar? The agenda today will be in the form of a scene-setting keynote address, followed by a panel of commentators and a discussion with questions and comments from the floor. Our keynote speaker is Mr. Kaki Kamal from UNOPS. I'll introduce him in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. And then our panelists represent a range of sectors important to this topic. Ms. Vicky Antonio, representing the infrastructure funders, Ms. Warapon Punyakanak, representing the public sector, Ms. Visaphone Intilath, representing the private sector, and Mr. Mazarol Alam from the UN or the multilateral sector. I'll also talk a little bit more about them as I introduce them when it's their turn to speak. Of course, we'd like to warm everyone up by conducting a quick poll to emphasize a few facts to introduce the topic. I'm going to ask Sugar to just cue that up in the meantime, the first question. I'm also going to ask you to please use the chat box to comment or ask questions throughout the session. In the discussion, we'll use the chat and any raised hands to queue up some of the discussion points. So please signal your intention to ask a question or to comment on something by putting a note into the chat box. It's really helpful. Please make sure that your name is clearly visible if you'd like to ask a question. That's just really helpful from a facilitation perspective. And please keep yourself muted. Of course, our technical team will also be on standby to mute people just to ensure there's no auditory interruption or interference as the speakers are presenting their inputs. And also, if you could please turn your camera on if you're invited to speak. So let's get to the poll. I'd like you to please answer the questions as quickly as possible. Let's get through this quite quickly. So the first question is about what percentage of greenhouse gas emissions infrastructure is responsible for. And Sugar, if the results are ready, let's just give them a beat. And then if the results are ready, you can present them immediately. Great, perhaps you can share the results now. Maybe I should be looking at the poll itself to comment on them. Sugar, okay, I can't seem to find my view for the poll. Could you just give me a cue on what the results are looking like?
Thanks, Sharon. For our first question on how much infrastructure is responsible for greenhouse gas emission, about 30 well, 79% of the participants have, or 36% of the participants have answered 79%, and 27% of the participants have answered 54%, and 38 for, or 36% have answered 38%.
Great. So the majority have got the right answer. Of course, the incredible number is that 79% of greenhouse gas emissions are expected to be due to infrastructure. Thank you so much. Let's move to the second question quickly. Infrastructure accounts for what percentage of climate change adaptation costs? Let's give everybody just a minute to answer some of that, and then we can comment on the results. Yes, okay, once again. No, in fact, the race is still on. I'm now able to see the results. So right now, the majority feel that only 33% of adaptation costs will be spent on infrastructure. In fact, it is 88%. So once again, this big emphasis on the responsibility that we have as people working in the infrastructure sector, because almost all of the expenditure on adaptation interventions will be spent on physical infrastructure. Well, on infrastructure, but on physical things. Okay, so thank you very much for answering that question. Let's move on to the third question in the poll and the last one. Thank you, Sugar. Great. The world is currently on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees on average above pre-industrial levels. And most people, let's just give you a minute to answer. Most people are saying false, and that is correct. So we're not on track to meet the targets that we've set so far. Okay, thank you so much for engaging in that poll. Let me just move on. Okay, if you do want to reference any of this data, the questions and the data comes from a report that was recently put out a few weeks ago by UNOPS, Oxford University and UNEP. The report is called Infrastructure for Climate Action. And I know that the links to that report and a few others are also in the announcement for the event on the website, on the Resilience Hub website, and on the various websites of the organizers. So please reference those reports and take a look at them in more detail after this discussion. So COP26, like previous COPs, is a bit of an emotional roller coaster. We're at the end almost of the proceedings. And we started in the first week by hearing really optimistic talk of keeping the target for increases in average temperatures to 1.5 degrees and sticking to those targets. But we've had a dose of reality this week. We're already at 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures in 2021. The climate disaster is happening, and it's happening on our watch. Even with strong commitments to reduce emissions, which are currently being discussed in the political sessions, we're expected to achieve average temperature increases of 2 degrees in the next 30 years and potentially 3 degrees by the end of the century. This, of course, we know will cause extreme weather, sea level rise, widespread loss of biodiversity, droughts, heat waves, fires and storms, and will cause devastation across large parts of the world. And this region in particular, Southeast and East Asia, is particularly vulnerable to many of the hazards. The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius will be a death sentence for the Maldives, said the president of that country. Most of us, and certainly the younger and future generations, will live to see a more hostile and uncertain world, one in which large parts of the planet will be uninhabitable. We're living through the history of how humans destroyed or perhaps saved this planet. Today's session will explore the central role that infrastructure plays in this story. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, we'd like to play a short video based on the recent publication. And I'd like to ask Sugar to please play it now.
Infrastructure. It touches every aspect of our lives. From the water we drink to the way we travel to work, infrastructure plays a vital role in our development. But what if the very buildings, bridges and roads that are so critical to our lives were also the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions? This is one of the findings from the latest report, Infrastructure for Climate Action, published jointly by UNOPS, the University of Oxford and UNEP. According to the report, infrastructure is responsible for a massive 79% of total greenhouse gas emissions, prompting calls for urgent action.
It's realized more and more the importance of infrastructure to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, to address the climate emergency. And for obvious reasons, we need to get things right today.
Along with its findings, the report presents a range of measures that practitioners can take to support climate action and sustainable development across the infrastructure lifecycle.
Adapting infrastructure is very context specific. It depends on what infrastructure you're talking about, where you are. And so we need data and expertise to make all of those difficult choices, to get those choices right. It means building capacity within institutions, within governments, within engineering communities.
The report comes just ahead of the 26th UN Climate Change Conference that will see leaders from across the world come together to commit to urgent climate action.
Thank you so much. Right, now I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, my colleague, Kaki Kamal, who leads the UNOPS team in Nepal. Kamal has more than 25 years experience, 12 years of which are with UNOPS, working in the infrastructure field in some of the most hazardous areas in the world. And he is well placed to set the scene for us on the importance of infrastructure for resilience in the face of our changing climate. Kamal's an engineer, and some of his career highlights include the development of Nepal's largest highways and managing a number of social infrastructure projects which combine infrastructure with capacity building, which of course is fundamental to achieving our sustainable and resilient outcomes. Over to you, Kamal.
Thank you, Sharon. Can you have the slides, please? Good morning and good afternoon. Issue that we are now all climate change. Climate change is a global challenge and one that can only be solved with a global mindset and with a global collaboration. We have shown that we are capable of finding global solutions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and now we face even bigger challenge in the form of climate change. I have today more or less 10 minutes or so to talk to you about the key role that infrastructure plays in addressing the challenge. So I would like to focus on two key areas. First, what do we actually mean by resilient infrastructure and why is it so important? And secondly, what must we all do together to see this transformational change that we are really looking for? In this slide, we're trying to show what kind of disasters we are facing due to climate change. Firstly, I think we all now know that climate change is creating massive impacts, be it floods, droughts, wildfires, and it is only going to get worse in the coming days. As the International Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, noted recently, climate change is widespread, it is rapid, and it is also intensifying. Prolonged monsoons in the Asia region, rapidly melting glaciers in the Himalayas and the polar regions, wildfires and unexpected hurricanes are only a few examples which demonstrate that the wide range effects of climate change. Next, please. Can we have the next slide? Thank you. In fact, climate change affects all of us in a very different ways. As we know, some parts of the world suffer more from climate hazards compared to others, and some groups suffer more than others. It is now quite well understood that women are more vulnerable to climate change disasters. Next, please. Now we're coming to the commitments for climate action. With the growing awareness at all levels in the society of the need for climate action, national governments have unique obligations and responsibilities. And the financing partners have now started prioritizing climate action. So as awareness is growing, the key policymakers now here at COP26 must play their part in order that we in the development sector have the framework and the financial commitments to play our part. Thank you. Next, please. And so what can we possibly do in this situation? There are two ways that we can actually take climate action. Firstly, the mitigation. We need to put our best efforts to limit climate change through reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of infrastructure, it means massive shifts in construction materials that we use for construction. Secondly, of course, adaptation. There is now no overnight solution to climate change. We now need to learn to live with changing climate, and the only way we can do it is by more resilient in our designs and implementation of infrastructure activities. Next, please. So it is important that we need to develop construction technologies with minimum damage to the environment. In this slide, basically, I think we did a little bit of this in the polls that we conducted earlier. On the one hand, infrastructure is responsible for almost 79% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we can say it is a part of the problem. And this negative impact can be reduced significantly through mitigation measures like using green technologies, alternative material for construction, and adopting energy efficient passive designs such as solar power and using nature-based solutions in construction. However, we also have to realize that infrastructure accounts for almost 88% of adaptation costs that we are currently spending. So it is also a part of the solution. We need to ensure that we are building, what we are building now is fit for purpose, also for the future. And the construction we do today does not actually result in more problems in the future. Next, please. So now we can easily realize that there is no doubt that infrastructure is actually the cornerstone of modern society, from the supply of energy and water and the treatment of waste to the provision of effective healthcare system and education services. It is infrastructure that enables society to function effectively, grow, and prosper. With the understanding that infrastructure is the enabler in societies to grow and prosper, we need to find ways and means to ensure that negative effects of infrastructures to the environment is minimized. We have to promote green technologies. We have to have more research and development to find new environment-friendly construction materials. We have to optimize use of local construction materials and also promote local technologies. Next, please. Can we have the next slide? Yes, thank you. Sometimes when buildings collapse or access to services is disrupted, infrastructures can be the main reason for disasters that occur. As you can see in the picture, and in this slide, we can actually see the importance of resilient infrastructure. When you compare these two earthquakes which took place in Japan and Haiti, we experienced that the results were vastly different, mainly due to the infrastructure that was developed. Not just the buildings, but the infrastructure systems, which play a key role in day-to-day services, which become even more key in the aftermath of a disaster. The failure of infrastructure creates disasters and is sometimes the main cause of the response need after the disasters. This slide also reminds me of the 2015 earthquakes in Nepal, which caused more than 9,000 deaths. And that was actually a trigger to have new building codes in Nepal for resilient design and construction methods. UNOPS was also a part of this construction effort, supporting the government to build back better and also trying to leave no one behind after the effect of the 2015 earthquakes in Nepal. So as you can see in the slides, if you just see the number of deaths in Haiti and Japan, it's so vastly different. So because the construction in Japan was much more resilient to that which was available in Haiti during the earthquakes. So we can now realize, how important is resilient infrastructure, especially to face the challenges of climate change. Thank you. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this slide, I'm trying to see, what is actually the definition of a resilient infrastructure. Here, I give the definition taken from the resilience shift. And what this means is that resilient infrastructure will be able to continue to provide essential services due to its ability to withstand, adapt, and recover from whatever shocks and stresses it may face at the present and also in the future. So currently, climate change is not adequately addressed in the infrastructure designs, and this needs to change. Thank you. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the vast majority of infrastructure currently being built is not actually sustainable. Neither it is resilient enough or inclusive enough. So we do not have the knowledge and competency mainstream throughout the industry to do this kind of effect in infrastructure. But the world is actually demanding it now. Not only do we have the moral accountability to our future generations to change this, but now we have this mainstream political and economic commitments also available, which is also underpinned by the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and now the COP26. So I don't think we have any more excuses now. We need a transformation in our approach to embed sustainability, resilience, and inclusivity in the standards we plan, deliver, and manage our infrastructure globally. We need to be driven by policy, motivated by finance, and supported with the right technical knowledge. There's a lot of focus on policy and financing, but we need to ensure all of us, whichever background we come from, have the knowledge and skills to understand and implement these innovative new approaches. Thank you. Next slide, please. It's taking some time. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, before I finish, I'd like to leave you with some key messages that I have. Firstly, infrastructure is fundamental for governments to achieve their commitments. Without radical change to how infrastructure is planned, delivered, and managed, we will not be able to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, COP26, or the Sustainable Development Goals. Second, infrastructure is central to addressing climate action through both mitigation, such as reducing greenhouse emissions, and adaptation by increasing the resilience of our infrastructure. Thirdly, infrastructure decisions made today will impact generations to come because it is built to last. We have a unique opportunity now to make the right infrastructure decisions to ensure a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive future for all. Fourthly, our current infrastructure is not well equipped to deal with the immense and unprecedented needs, such as the impacts of changing climate. We need infrastructure that is resilient to shocks and stresses, and we need to minimize the effect of infrastructure on the climate to meet the mitigation measures. And finally, planning infrastructure for low emission and resilient future makes rethinking required at all levels. This planning needs to go hand in hand with the efforts to mobilize the trillions of dollars that is required to finance a resilient infrastructure for the future. Next, please. We are at a critical history. We are at a critical moment in history and where transformational changes are required starting here at COP26 with real global commitments which can drive policy and financing, and then planning and delivery, and finally ongoing management and maintenance of our infrastructure in order that infrastructure is no longer the problem, but actually the solution. I strongly believe that we each have a role to play in this story, and I look forward to hearing some of the experiences and perspectives from our distinguished panel. Thank you. Thank you everyone for your attention. Back to you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Kamal, for setting the scene so well and so clearly. I particularly appreciate the point you made that although all people are affected by climate change, not all are affected equally, and we have to be concerned about the most vulnerable in our communities. Kamal has also given us a real clear call to action. We have to deliver different infrastructure differently. We have to think about planning and designing infrastructure. We have to find new technologies and solutions for our infrastructure needs, and we have to rethink infrastructure financing, operations, and maintenance. Our panelists are now challenged to help us understand some of the new ways of doing things. Today, we have 4 speakers from 4 different organizations, and they will all share relevant experiences and knowledge about catalyzing resilience in infrastructure. We're going to start with Vicky Antonio. Vicky is a consultant from ADB's Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. She's an architect and urban planner by profession with more than 20 years of development experience in urban climate resilience, local economic development, urban governance, knowledge management, monitoring and evaluation, and private sector development. Over to you, Vicky.
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning, everyone. So I hope you can hear me well. Okay, thanks. Sugar, yeah, please share the slide. Okay, so let me just briefly talk about the trust fund. So I'm working with the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. It's a multi-donor trust fund managed by ADB under the Urban Financing Partnership Facility. So with a commitment of about 100 million financing from the Rockefeller Foundation and the governments of Switzerland and the UK, it aims to build the resilience of 2 million people in 8 developing member countries through better planning and provision of climate resilient infrastructure. With increasing frequency and intensity of extreme climate events, many cities in Asia and the Pacific have borne the brunt of damages due to poor infrastructure and high population densities, many of whom are what we were talking about earlier, poor and vulnerable residents living in high-risk areas that are prone to flooding, storm surge, landslides, among others. However, convincing governments to incorporate resilience features into infrastructure is often challenged by two main things, what we have observed. Now, one is the high cost for engineering solutions, and second, the probability that an extreme climate event requiring such thresholds will actually occur in the next 25, 50, or 100 years. Next slide, please. So UCCRTF is trying to catalyze a shift towards resilient investments, not so much by financing climate resilient infrastructure, but primarily by testing and piloting new approaches to develop proof of concept that we hope will convince DMCs of the value of investing in what we call the resilience dividend. So within ADB, the trust fund has identified strategic entry points for its interventions throughout the ADB project cycle, because we know that extends for anywhere from 6 months to 8 years. No? And so through this approach, it tries to address all levels of urban infrastructure the urban infrastructure development chain, from upstream, looking at policy and institutional strengthening, to downstream interventions such as co-financing and demonstrating or piloting of projects. So through this approach, the trust fund interventions have to some extent been effective in leveraging new investment. So let me just cite two examples. So one of the key learnings of the trust fund is adopting a systemic versus a sectoral approach. Building urban climate change resilience requires more than just investment in infrastructure. It requires a combination of hard and soft measures across scales and across sectors. So in the case of the Bangladesh Coastal Towns Environmental Improvement Project, UCCRTF supported upstream work by carrying out climate risk and vulnerability assessments, including the preparation of climate risk integrated urban plans during the project preparation phase. So this helped inform the sub-projects that should be part of the loan. And then, however, two of the towns that were identified as among the most vulnerable were not included in the loan. So the trust fund allocated a $6 million investment grant as additional financing attached to the loan to finance the construction of cyclone shelters and emergency access roads, plus the preparation of integrated drainage and fecal solid waste management plans, again, to support the flooding issue. So during the design phase of the grant, SPADE, which is a web-based GIS platform here in the upper right corner, so SPADE was used to verify the location of the shelters to ensure that these would not be flooded in the event of a cyclone. And finally, at the community level, UCCRTF is also supporting a pilot for community-based solid waste management program. So here you can see UCCRTF had activities at the regional level, looking at the coastal areas, at the city and community levels. And in terms of the project cycle, the trust fund supported preparation, detailed engineering design and implementation, and also looking across sectors, not just the flooding and drainage, but also on the solid waste management aspect, which is very closely linked to flooding. So with the positive results emerging from CTIP 1, a second phase was negotiated by the government of Bangladesh. So picking up from the lessons from its predecessor, UCCRTF again supported project preparation for phase 2. But this time, excuse me, the CRVAs incorporated both historical and climate projections, and it further categorized risk per town on the basis of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So the granularity of the data provides better information on specific climate risks and the severity of the same for each city, thereby providing better guidance on sub-project selection, detailed engineering design, and site selection. So this kind of approach is what Kamal was talking about earlier, is that it can help reduce costs and, more importantly, build infrastructure that is fit for purpose. So the loan, the forthcoming loan will also pilot nature-based solutions to complement traditional gray infrastructure, for which they were able to get a 4 million grant from the Asian Development Fund. And it will also have interventions to build resilience in livelihoods, planning, and gender. So again, this is the cross-sectoral approach that we are talking about. So another example I would like to elaborate on is in the use of nature-based solutions. So this is a emerging innovative technology that is showing to be quite effective, no? Which offers equally effective alternatives to traditional gray infrastructure at lower costs. So by supporting NBS pilots, we are trying to generate the evidence to demonstrate their effectiveness and again, hopefully convince DMCs to use these in combination with traditional gray infrastructure. So here in the second photo, in Indonesia, UCCRT have supported a project called Revitalization of Informal Settlements using a water-sensitive approach together with Monash University. So it piloted the implementation of non-network NBS solutions for the delivery of water supply and sanitation services for an informal settlement. So building on the success of this pilot, the government of Australia has approved a grant of about $3 million to replicate it in 6 other communities. So again, this is proof of concept of mobilizing, leveraging new investment. And then in the case of the Philippines, the fund supported a master plan review and sustainable water supply study for the 9,500 hectare New Clark City. It's a greenfield development. So it focused on using NBS to give the river room to grow instead of the originally proposed plan, which channels the flow through highly engineered solutions. So it had the dual outcome of reducing development costs and increasing land value capture owing to the scenic environment of the river park. So this paved the way for nature-based solutions to influence subsequent development activities. It includes a follow-up investment from the UK government under the Global Future Cities program to build a 45-hectare park in New Clark City, which is the largest park to be built in the Philippines in the last 50 years. So aside from the Central Park, there is an estimated 570 million of new investments for new projects in water supply, wastewater, and power distribution in the National Government Administrative Center, which will be built in New Clark City. So, with these 2 examples, I just wanted to illustrate how the Trust Fund is supporting ADB projects to better integrate resilience into the design of the projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Your business-like approach makes it seem like this really tough space, which is around the assessment and decision-making around the cost benefits of new solutions. You make it seem quite straightforward, but it is a very, very difficult space. I appreciate those examples very much because they show how we can achieve the resilience benefits through the use of technology, by learning, by doing and making evidence-based decisions. These are really great, clear examples, and I hope to see them mainstreamed and see them scaled up to actually deliver on the promise. Thank you so much for that. Right, we're going to move on now to invite Woraporn Punya-Kanok to talk. Woraporn is a senior sustainable designer at the Research and Innovation for Sustainability Center, the RISC, with Magnolia Quality Development Corporation Limited. Representing the private sector in this discussion, she monitors evolving trends and technologies related to well-being, climate resilience, the circular economy, and sustainability in real estate. Over to you, Woraporn.
Thank you, Sharon. And good morning, everyone. Okay. My name is Woraporn Punya-Kanok. Today I'm going to talk about building resilience in property development. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. As mentioned by Komal, infrastructure accounts for 79% of greenhouse gas emission. Among that 79%, building sector accounts for 17% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Next, please. Buildings provide many services in our daily lives, such as healthcare, housing and shelter, education, markets, recreational and cultural activities, etc. They are an indispensable part, especially in an urban setting. Before going further, let me introduce MQDC, or Magnolia Quality Development Corporation, which is a property developer with headquarters in Bangkok, Thailand. We are dedicated to pushing the sector's boundaries to change society for the better, with the vision to be a leading and innovative global property developer, fostering sustainability and well-being for all. And QDC established its own research center called Research and Innovation for Sustainability Center, or RISC for short. RISC research and develop innovations through local and international collaboration to improve quality of life for all beings. RISC, with its 990 square meter based in Bangkok, is the first organization in Thailand and Southeast Asia to be awarded WELL certification at gold level for new and existing interiors by the IWBI. Our philosophy of for all well-being is unique that we do not only focus on human well-being, but we care for the well-being of all living things. We have developed our own biodiversity standards which act as a guide on what to do or target to achieve throughout our project life cycles. However, the world is changing and we need to adapt and prepare ourselves for the changing climate. To build a resilient real estate portfolio and future adaptive communities, we have developed our own resilience framework for use in our project development. Our resilience framework gives overview of both shocks and stresses and opportunities that they bring. In this slide, the shocks and stresses resilience framework is divided into 3 parts. One on the left is nature and environment, which includes water, ground and land, natural disaster, air pollution, waste and sanitation. The middle one is living and infrastructure, which includes system disruption, incidents such as fire, power failure, health issues, education, and food issues such as food insecurity. The third part is about society and economy, which includes safety and security, issues related to socio-economic, socio-spatial, and socio-cultural. Shocks and stresses may seem overwhelming, but they also present many opportunities that we can take. Therefore, we also develop the Opportunities Resilience Framework. This one is divided into 3 sections. The first one on the left, mitigation, includes opportunities such as circular design, usage of low impact and low carbon materials, buildings that use renewable energy, and with energy efficiency. The second section is adaptation, which focuses on operation of buildings in terms of emergency preparedness, risk management. The third section reflects our philosophy of for all well-being, that we also care for the nature and community. This section includes nutrition and comfort of residents and building users, water and waste, and our social responsibility towards society. From the Opportunities Resilience Framework, we also developing a guideline for property development that set infrastructure and building performance target. Details are, for example, efficient cooling systems, integration of green infrastructure, passive design, construction waste reduction, energy and water efficiency, etc. We set a performance target that our buildings should aim for and achieve in order to be more resilient. In summary, building sector is another important sector of infrastructure that plays a vital role in our daily life. By thinking and planning ahead, we hope to build resilience in our projects and deliver our philosophy of for all well-being. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prone. I really appreciate from your presentation the very comprehensive framing of resilience in the housing sector. Of course, housing is critical to to achieving the inclusive and diversity objectives that we want to achieve across the board, the triple bottom line. But it's interesting that you look at both the resilience opportunities in terms of the environments that you're creating and your operating model as a business in the real estate sector. So that was a really useful input. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please, can I move on now to introduce Visiphone Interlaf, the Deputy Director of Housing and Urban Planning from the department in the Ministry of Public Works and Transport in Laos. Visiphone represents the public sector in this panel. She holds qualifications in civil engineering and environmental urban planning and has 20 years of government experience working on planning and infrastructure developments in Laos. Over to you, Visiphone.
Good morning. My name is Sapon Ichilat, Deputy Director, Department of Housing and Urban Planning, Ministry of Public Work and Transport of Laos. Today, I will talk about resilient infrastructure in Laos, PDR. From the earthquake, an effect from climate change, Laos in the previous year, 7 areas of Laos had been affected from the flood, particularly from a dam collapse. In the southern part of Laos, which caused an extensive damage infrastructure such as for the road, electricity, and for the house in the village. Meanwhile, in urban area, highlight building construction and development increased by the both local and foreign investors. It on does need have a resilient structure. Next. Currently, department has received grant and loan from the ADB and World Bank for the urban development project around the country. This includes solid waste management, drainage, and canal system development. The construction design had been considered to resilient infrastructure in terms of the standards should allow conditions. The next. Department of Housing and Urban Planning have designed for the simple house for the new development at the rural area and this project and to provide construction guidelines for the build permanent house at the low cost and resilient enough to endure for climate change. And also for urban planning for the grow-up. Please next for me, right? Next. Yeah, for the urban development, DHUP, Department of Housing and Urban Planning, has devised regulation for the controlling and managing large and high-rise building. But nowadays, we have adapting building code for the control highlight building. This project, some of building on the on construction and the some of area is prepared to develop. That's a center and Vientiane, Laos. And also we have prepared to drafting standard for the clean building. Please, the challenge and requirement. In the challenge, inadequate funding and low capacity outdated. And the challenge in developing urban planning and infrastructure as to limit funding to help experts and improve capacity for the local architect and engineer. And those who estimate the location are usually lacking practical experience. For this case, we need assistance and cooperation for law, regulation standard, and technical guidelines, estimate in controlling high-rise building and improving urban planning infrastructure in order to support our urban planning development in resilient and sustainable way. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Persephone. So that is a really practical example of how important planning and design is. If we want to innovate, if we want to introduce the nature-based solutions that are important to us, it's very important to start with planning and design, particularly in the housing case, as Persephone has explained. Thank you so much for that. Our last panelist is Muzarol Alam, who's happy for us to call him Babu. Babu is the Regional Coordinator for Climate Change in Asia and the Pacific at UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. He has more than 20 years experience working in the climate change field, in government and the academic sectors. He's worked in Bangladesh and in the UN development sector across Asia at the regional scale. He's made key contributions to a number of significant climate change initiatives, such as the International Planet for Climate Change Fifth Assessment Report. Over to you, Babu.
Thank you, Sharon. I was listening both Kamal, Vicky, Warpon, and Visapon. And then what I'm going to talk is basically reinforcing many of the points that they have already mentioned and talked about. But I will be talking more in the context of the knowledge for adaptation and what kind of the knowledge are necessary for building the resilience, including the resilience for infrastructure sector. So one of our initiative is called the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network, which is a network that support the capacity building, support bringing the knowledge together. And one of the activities under the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network is the adaptation, the forum on climate change. And that's basically provide the platform for the different adaptation practitioners coming from the different sectors and sharing their knowledges and experiences, as well as talking what are our need in terms of the building the resilience for all. Now, this year, in March, actually, we have organized our 7th Asia Pacific, the Climate Change Adaptation Forum. And the theme of the forum was enabling resilience for all and the critical decade to scale up action. As we all are in this critical decade, it started in the 2021 in the context of the sustainable development, in the context of the climate change, the Paris, the goal, as well as the Sendai, the framework for action. So what we have done in March, we managed to brought more than 1,000 the participants who attended over 5 days and discussed about the 5 enabling the condition that requires the resilience for all. And many of those elements has already been mentioned. And those 5 areas are the policies and the climate governance, the planning and the processes, the science and assessment, the technology and the practices, and obviously the last one was the finance and investment. Now, when we looked into the policy and the climate governance issues, many aspects has already been talked about, the mitigation and adaptation. But when we looked into the intervention, either the infrastructure intervention, gray, green, the natural infrastructure, what the participants talked about in terms of the policy and the governance, it requires a whole of society approach. And it requires the systematic inclusion of the different or all stakeholders, including the vulnerable community, the marginalized people. So there's the whole issue of whole of society and the inclusiveness issues. So when we looked into also this, the policy and the governance, one of the things came very strongly that the resilience of one person or one community or a country should not be built at the expense of the other's resilience. So this is the whole aspect when we talk about the maladaptation or the ill development planning etc. So the governance need to play a critical role to avoid that the situation. So what kind of the support it is also required. What the participants talk about, that the countries and the sectors need to mainstream the resilience in their plan and the policy, and through a systematic thinking. And without a systematic thinking, we may lead to the ill development plan or the activities or the infrastructure that we're designing may not be delivering the right goods at the end. So that is one of the area that they said that we need to bring the changes. Also, they talked about within the policy and the governance that we need to focus on strengthening the delivery system for the resilience outcome by improving the procedure, the processes, the system, and bringing about a cultural change within the organization. And this is what I'd like to just mention when one of the panel member, I think is Varapon, talked about the whole circularity within the building design and delivering. It's not only for the people, but also for the nature and making at a living environment. So that is in a kind of the changes required at the organizational level. Now let me move to the the second area, which is the planning and the processes. So it is another building block for building the resilience. And then one of the thing came that if we look into the resilience, it needs to be considered as a journey, because in the climate change, what we are talking is not only the impact that we are facing today, but also the impact that we are going to face in future. So whole the resilience building need to be considered as a journey and need to be adjusted as we move. And then within that journey, it is again, they talked about the system thinking, but also the right-based approach is necessary. And another aspect that they have talked about is the planning and the processes is the breaking the silos. If we look into even the infrastructure, it is not only the infrastructure that involved in one particular the sector. Maybe it is involved in one particular sector in terms of the designing and the delivery. But if we look into the services provided by those sectors, it is providing the services to other sectors. So that is the reason what we also need to think about is the breaking the silos, both the horizontal and the vertical. And one of the things that has been highlighted is that we need to promote the participation of the all stakeholders by integrating the channel of the participation at all stages. It's not only the stage of the planning or stage of the implementation or the stage of when we are asking for the money. So at all level, it requires the participation of the people. And that participation will ensure both the bottom up and the top down, the planning processes. And then through the top down and the bottom up, we'll able to also learn from each other how we can enhance the benefit through the right planning processes. We have talked a lot about on the science and the assessment during the forum. And particularly one of the aspect came, I'm not going to take much of the time to explain the other area, but one of the things came, which is very important in terms of the infrastructure, both in the physical infrastructure as well as the natural infrastructure that we are talking about, is the transboundary dimension of those infrastructure. How those infrastructure is going to impact outside that administrative boundary of that infrastructure happening. And that transboundary is not necessarily always need to be think about the transboundary outside the national boundary, but even we need to think about within the national boundary, there are the trans within the country, the aspect, so that we will able to avoid again the impact by using the science properly. And then when we're talking about the science and the assessment, what we have also heard that it is important to use the science from an user-centric point of view. It's basically type of the data, the type of the information, type of the scientific that in providing to the different user is basically need to be very user-centric, so that the user will able to use that science and the data either for the planning or the decision making, or even writing the proposal that how their the adaptation or the resilience investment is going to address the climate change which will come in future. And this is where they talked about that we need to translate the climate model outputs into the inputs for building the complex, the risk scenarios to support the evidence-based the decision making in multiple sectors to strengthen the climate resilience. So let me move into the fourth area, which is the technology and practices. And if we look into the infrastructure, including the building, the technology and the practices are very, very important. And then here, what we have heard from the participants that the technologies and innovations need to be based in the nature and come with the social dimension. So we cannot only focus on the technology on itself, but it needs to be considered within the nature and the social dimension and how the technology is going to function. And they have clearly recognized that one size does not fit for all. And this is where we need to think about the context specificity, as Kamal has mentioned as well, in terms of the context, in terms of the different group of the vulnerable people, and that integrated and the participatory approach is necessary to understand that what kind of the technology and practices will really help the vulnerable community, really help to build the infrastructure more resilient. So this is what we have heard during the forum as a need. So, and they have also talked about that we need to empower the people who are going to benefit from that technologies. So without empowering the people, the technology may become an obsolete or may not be giving the right results, because if we are not going to empower people to use it. Let me end by talking about the finance. As we all know, the finance is a big thing, including what the discussion happening right now in Glasgow, talking about how much money is necessary. But in terms of the infrastructure, let me just mention one thing, and many of you have heard that about $130 trillion asset owners now have committed that they will be investing to make those assets the climate neutral, and hopefully they will be also considering that the asset will be the climate resilient too. But what we have heard during the forum, that yes, the finances is happening, but the space of financing is not adequate. The climate change is happening faster than the fund is flowing. So we need to find ways to provide the funding to the community, to the type of the infrastructure that we need to design. And then one of the strong messages came out of that discussion is, under the current planning, it is more on a short term and maximum going to the medium term planning in terms of the time horizon. And that's the way the financing is happening. It needs to move from medium to long term, the planning and financing for that. So that is what we have heard. And thank you, Sharon, for giving me the opportunity to share what we have learned within the context of what kind of the knowledges, the practices are necessary to foster the resilience and building the resilience for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Babu. So what you have described is a really interesting multi-level transition management framework and approach. I really appreciate that you looking at the whole of society approach, at multi-stakeholder interventions and awareness raising and capturing actions in the most inclusive way in terms of who's involved, and also the scale of focus from policies and strategies and standards right through the various levels to technology and to finance. So that's a really useful way to sum up a lot of the presentations we've heard as well. I'd like to ask people to indicate if they have any questions by raising their hands. We are going to go into a little bit of discussion, and perhaps I will start the conversation off with the panelists by asking a few questions. If we think about the subject of catalyzing resilience in the infrastructure sector, there are a couple of aspects we need to consider, including scaling up innovations, scaling up some of the tests that have seen positive results. We also need to think about partnering because of this very inclusive and broad-based set of solutions. We all need to own the problem and the solutions. And then, of course, raising awareness and making sure that there are both bottom down and top up interventions, and that we hear the voices of our beneficiaries, of the tenants and residents in our housing schemes, and the communities, the most vulnerable communities that we need to serve. So those are just a few points. Perhaps let me start with a specific question about scaling up and the roles that you all play in making sure that this new way of doing things becomes the norm. Let me start with Warapon, if you don't mind. Can you please come in and just comment?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so about scaling up. All right. I think one thing in what we are facing in the private sector is that there is a lack of regulatory framework for resilience in buildings or in infrastructure. So like our organization developed our own. So from the, I think for the framework or the this kind of resilience thinking to be scaling up, to be embedded in the industry more widely, I think the decision makers of the companies need to be properly informed of the risk that they are facing, and that climate change is now a source of financial risk. Like the climate risk is now financial risk as well. So when they realize that the risk they are facing, this kind of resilience framework will serve as a guide for them to make better decisions on where and how to mitigate and adapt their portfolio into.
Great, thank you so much. Vicky, can I ask you to comment as well? Because you also have the whole proof of concept approach. What do you do to try and make sure that those ideas are scaled up and mainstreamed? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. So yes, I think the trust fund is in an opportune position sitting within ADB, because as a trust fund, we have some flexibility in terms of piloting new approaches. So this is really what we're trying to do in terms of, looking at nature-based solutions, different approaches in how to integrate resilience into the ADB projects, and not just focusing on specific points, but as I mentioned earlier, looking at different entry points in the project cycle, because as we have learned, resilience really requires a systemic approach. You come at it from different entry points. And then and on top of that also, like what you mentioned earlier, it's really important to get the stakeholders on board and help them understand the risks that they are facing, but at the same time also bringing them into the design process, like in the community-led projects that is being supported under RTA by Oxfam. It really adopted a bottom-up community design process where they try to identify, what are the risks they are facing, and on that basis determine the priority investments that will really address their daily issues. So in terms of resilience, so I think that is also very important, that we just don't we don't start from the top, but also bringing in the voices from the bottom, because these are the poor and vulnerable who are really most at risk. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Some good points there. And Visiphone, if I can ask you on that subject of scaling up, about the role that your standards play in the way that housing is delivered in Laos. so in some ways, government, of course, is in a very powerful position to influence the mainstream adoption of new practices. And how do you make sure that those new practices are included in your standards? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, for the case you asked, and the local government to try to support for the effect from climate, right? But we cannot do all of the country that like that. We have a limited for experience, I think, and also for the funding. So who responsible on this case and have enough knowledge to provide to support? And in my opinion, I think that yes.
Great, thank you so much. Perhaps I can go to Kamal now. Kamal, so as UNOPS, we obviously our delivery practice changes over time. Please, can you tell us a little bit of your experience of how these new ways of delivering infrastructure can be rolled out through a delivery agency and that works in the implementation space like UNOPS? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon, for this very important query. Actually, I mean, construction industry sometimes is in a dilemma. Sometimes we say we have to go for low-cost solutions, usually competitive bidding, and we don't actually properly consider the kind of solutions that needs to be incorporated, and considering the climate change. Usually, I would say the cost can increase, the designs can be more complicated, and sometimes we may not have enough kind of research and development to consider all this. So there are a lot of challenges, but there are solutions also. And I think although there are policies, I think even like the multilateral banks have strong policies on environment, many things needs to be considered. They are there, but in the practical world, I think we are not doing enough. I mean, usually there are a lot of, let's say constraints. I mean, governments and others have these financing issues. They sometimes opt for, slightly lower cost solutions to the optimal solutions, which can be, life cycle considerations and future considerations. I can just give an example of one relatively large project in Nepal, funded by Asian Development Bank, where this water supply project, looked forward by everybody. And it was a proper design based on, all the information that was available in the past. But actually, now we realize that we did not have enough information on the possible climate change and heavy downfalls that sometimes we are experiencing all over the world. And we had this recent phenomenon in Nepal where we had this extremely heavy concentrated rainfall in the catchment area of that particular project. And the project that was going to be inaugurated and serving the whole population of Kathmandu's water supply now it has to be postponed, and some remedial measures are being considered. And that was particularly because we had this very concentrated heavy rainfalls for 2 days, which was actually not expected. It was, perhaps not experienced in the last 100 years or more. And basically, it was a cause of climate change. So there are challenges, but I think there is more research and planning needs to be done. At the same time, I think the cost of the life cycle cost should be the one which should be considered rather than the initial costs that are actually the main considerations for awarding contracts, whether they're small or big. So I would say there has to be a kind of shift in the understanding in the design, and also equally important is how best we implement them. And of course, we already talked about the construction materials, which also contribute to a large extent on climate, greenhouse emissions. So that is also one area where I think we all need to work together to find more environment friendly construction materials for the future. Thank you, Sharon.
Great, thanks, Kamal. Let me just round out this round of responses by going to Babu. So of course, knowledge is something that you raised as part of your framework, your approach in the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network. Can you perhaps comment on how important that is and how, you know, I've heard people say, so for example, in the cities space, cities just don't learn. And I've heard, you know, people lamenting that the demand is for standard building practice, and it's really difficult to shift that perception and that demand, that aspiration for something that's more nature-based or new technologies. So please, can you just comment on that a little bit? Thank you, as part of the scaling up.
Okay.
Discussion.
No, thank you, Sharon. Let me just build on what Kamal had just mentioned about if we look into the infrastructure and the design criteria that we are currently using. And in terms of the design criteria, which is obviously based on knowledge. And then what the knowledge that we are using in the design criteria is the historical events. And in the context of climate change, those historical events and the historical data is not going to provide us the strong basis for future, because the climate change is bringing the new knowledge, and that's need to be incorporated in the design. So the way we used to design the infrastructure based on the historical data and the evidences, it is no longer sufficient to design the infrastructure which will be resilient for future. So this is where the piece of knowledge is need to come. The science is providing, but I think what is also important is the user of those knowledge and information. That is where we need to invest and make those knowledge very specific for the different group of users. And this is very important aspect in our view. And I think the point that you have made that the people forget, I think this is very true. Because we remind ourselves when we face the problem, and over 5-10 years, we tend to forget that these things happen. I think this is part of the way the human adopted thing as a species.
Right. So with all of this talking during the community, the committee of the partners, of course, the point is that there's too much talking. But that is how we transfer knowledge. So the talking is still important, right? An event like this that goes back to the basics is really important to remind us all, even though we know some of these facts, we need to keep reinforcing the messaging all the time. So thank you very much. Okay, there has been a very nice exchange between Joseph, who asked a question, and Vicky, who answered it in the chat. Can I ask the two of you to please bring that into the recording? Joseph, if you don't mind coming online and asking your question, and Vicky can respond. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all of the speakers. It's been a really good session so far. Thanks. My question was quite specific to Vicky because her presentation covered the importance of making informed decisions based on evidence and data about the local needs and about the changing hazards in the face of climate change. It was more of a practical question. How do we actually do this, given that we don't really know what's going to happen with climate change in the next 10 years, let alone the next 30 or 100 years, depending on how long we're designing our infrastructure for. So yeah, thanks Vicky, over to you.
Okay, thanks for the question. So yeah, definitely it's really difficult. I think that's one of the challenges of really convincing governments to invest in resilience, because of the question mark on, is it going to happen and when will it happen? So one of the things that we have learned so far is that we need to use technology and use the information that is available to us. Like the platform we're using, Spade, is open source. It uses open source data. So so we are using readily available information. So people who want to use that kind of information don't need to purchase, proprietary software. So by using the technology, using the information available, somehow you better understand the risks and therefore narrow down the problem area. So like as I mentioned in my presentation, so for the second phase of CTIP, so we are looking at climate risks and vulnerabilities per town, looking at exposure, adaptation, and risk. So again, by narrowing down to these components, then you can better design infrastructure and at the same time decide what kind of infrastructure they will need and the specific design. So somehow that will reduce some of the guesswork. And then I think another important thing also is bringing in local knowledge, because a lot, especially in these informal settlements, or a lot of the coastal areas, at least in Bangladesh, that the damages are really not documented. So learning from the experience of the communities who have lived there for years and years, it will also reveal ways on what they've to these challenges, and that way we can you can somehow come up with a solution that bridges technology and local knowledge. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting exchange between the two of you. Let's use the last few minutes of the session to focus on the financing aspects of catalyzing resilience. Of course, we've heard about some of the problems. We've heard from Visiphone that there are budget shortages. We've heard from many of the commentators that it's about achieving the right sort of cost-benefit assessment, right sort of decisions around cost and benefit of new solutions, new ways of doing infrastructure. And we've also heard about how important financing partnerships are. So let's please just do a quick round as the final word from each of the panelists on any comments associated with that and any final points you'd like to make. I'm going to go in the order that you originally presented. So Kamal, you're up first. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. I think we had a very useful discussion on this very important topic of climate change, and particularly in relation to infrastructure. Of course, financing is going to be key for the future, and also the commitments that is required from all levels of society. It's not only the government, it's the private sector. And as we said, the importance of the local communities, particularly to actually face this challenge of climate change in the future. Regarding infrastructure itself, I think there is more to do on research and development, particularly as Babu mentioned that I think we don't have enough information right now of the actual effects of climate change. And I think a lot of research needs to go there. If we are to help those designers who actually have the knowledge and the information to actually do designs that will take care of the possible climate change effects coming our way. Because I think many of the failures that we observe are actually because such considerations were not properly done in the past. And also, I think the industry, the construction industry, as well as the infrastructure sector has to understand that nothing comes for free. There might be additional cost incurred at the moment, but somehow we have to manage this. We have to understand this carefully and convince all stakeholders that some additional cost is something which we should accept, so that the infrastructure that we do are there to last and also to withstand the possible effects of climate change, and are able to withstand possible stresses and effects of disasters in the future. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thank you so much, Kamal. Please, can I ask Vicky to comment on finance?
Yes, yeah, definitely. One of the challenges faced by the trust fund in the beginning was really convincing ADB project officers that it's important to bring in resilience into projects, because again, urban resilience is something that's still evolving, especially with worsening climate change scenarios. It's a moving target. We don't really know how to address it. But I think I think we're on the right track in terms of demonstrating by piloting and documenting these results, because unless it's a chicken and egg thing, unless you show proof of concept, people will be hesitant to invest in it. So I think by showing governments and multilateral development banks that these different combinations of solutions work, then it can leverage more financing. Like the saying, if you build it, it will come. So hopefully, this will continue. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Warapon, over to you for any comments on the financing points.
Okay. Before I move on to the financing, I would like to first answer Joseph's question about so there aren't yet regulatory or financial incentives in Thailand yet, but what MQDC is doing beyond standard requirement is because we want to deliver our philosophy of for all well-being. So I think what others can learn from this is that we all need to think what core values that we want to deliver to our users or customers are. And by seeing things in systems that human, community, and nature are all interconnected, we will be able to go beyond what is required in order to deliver the values. And about financing, yes, definitely financing is important. And I think I can also answer Vrinder's question a little bit here, that right now cost benefits calculations may not look good just yet, but it's partly because climate risks are not fully integrated into the calculation as financial risk. So I know it's difficult because risks are in their nature difficult to predict. But once we start to including more and more and look in longer term, building resilience now will save much more than paying for adaptation costs later on. Thank you.
Great. So on that point, I think that partnerships between the insurers and the insurers that make investments in long-term assets is really critical, between those stakeholders and the financiers, the lenders. If they can work more closely together, perhaps we'll crack that problem of pricing the long-term risks. Okay, Visaphone, quickly, a few points perhaps on the finance issues.
Yes, thank you. For the financing for the government, under my responsible, I mean that for the responsibility of Department of Housing and Urban Planning, we respond for drafting law, regulation or standards that for fund financing for support, there's the government support, but we for the yeah, for the parties we need for support from another organized from overseas and things for something like that. But we have a limited, one limited is for the knowledge, but we need to have some technical support. We need technical support, right? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Babu, you've got the last word.
Which is always difficult.
And so quick, please.
Yes. No, I'd like to make one quick point. If we look into the finance, the government has more money in terms of the development. If we are able to integrate climate change into the government development plan, that will bring the huge change and make our development resilient.
Great, great. Thank you so much for that point. I am so grateful to all of the speakers. You've done a great job of sharing your knowledge and inspiring action. So that was the whole point of the session. Thank you so much to the organizers. Thank you so much to the technical team supporting us. I'd like to wrap this up by just reinforcing once again, we're all going to have to be part of the solution. So strength to you all, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.